Most of us can name the things we want to change, the parts of life that just don't feel right. Maybe it's food, maybe it's money. Perhaps it's the way we keep showing up in our relationships, or maybe it's the promises we keep breaking to our own souls, the skills, the hobby, the creative life that we keep pushing to the edge of the map. Naming the change is easy, and starting feels heroic. But after a few days or a few weeks, life collects its usual debts. Time shrinks, energy thins out, and willpower goes with it. And the rulers of the old order, the habits and behaviors we tried to depose, show up again. Maybe you've met them. They arrive with the pressure of a world that doesn't know or care who you're trying to become. You can try change, they say, but you'll still do what you've always done. You'll still be what you've always been. Maybe you've heard that voice before. Maybe you're hearing it now. On the road to Athena, Theseus reaches Eleusis, Elewsina. There, he meets a cruel king who rules through custom, through how things are done. This is not an ambush. It's a public test from a reigning pattern that refuses to step aside. And the stakes for Theseus and for us could not be higher. Theseus is not alone in this struggle. There are three other stories that we'll talk about today. The story of Gilgamesh, of Jacob, and of Herakles. And they show us the same structures from a different angle. Together, they teach us two things. First, you don't win this kind of fight by trying to shove the opponent down and away. And second, the path of initiation is not completed just because someone offers you a crown. My name is Dimitri, and welcome to the Inward Sea. Hello, and thank you for joining me for this, the fifth episode in our Theseus series. Together, we're tracing his road from Troezina to Athena, not just as a mythic journey, but as a map of initiation, how a person grows into a new stage of life and earns the right to stand there. If this is your first time here, welcome. The Inward Sea is a podcast in which I use old stories and fragments of ancient imagination as a way of looking at what it means to grow up, to change, and to live meaningfully. Today, we'll catch up with Theseus as he approaches Eleusis, modern Elewsina, where he encounters Cercyon, the king of the region, famous for his cruelty towards travelers who enter his city and towards his own family. Before we move on, I want to share one idea I'll return to later after Theseus' encounter in Eleusis, when a victory could easily become a premature ending. In his book, The Soul's Code, James Hillman introduces what he calls the Acorn theory. The image is simple. An acorn doesn't just contain a vague potential, it carries a pattern. It carries a blueprint, an image of an oak. Plant it, and it won't grow into just anything. It grows in a particular direction with a particular shape. Hillman suggests something like this lives in each of us too. Each of us carries an image, whether we can name it or not, of what we are here to become. Sometimes we sense that shape early on. Sometimes we recognize it only in hindsight. Sometimes other people see it in us before we do. Hillman also insists that this isn't some modern invention. He places it in a much older stream of human imagination. And he's blunt about what we've lost. In a quote from Chapter 1, he says, "The concept of this individualized soul image has a long, complicated history. Its appearance in cultures is diverse and widespread, and the names for it are legion. Only our contemporary psychology and psychiatry omit it from their textbooks. The study and therapy of the psyche in our society ignore this factor, which other cultures regard as the kernel of character and the repository of individual fate. Plato had an older word for this, the daimon, an intermediary presence between the human and the divine. Not a demon in the modern sense, more like a guiding force you feel as a pull, a calling, a pressure towards the life that's actually yours. This calling can be delayed, but it doesn't disappear. When we ignore it for too long, it returns as what we would think of as symptoms, or as a dull sense that life has lost its meaning. This image, Hillman notes, speaking about the daimon or the acorn, doesn't tolerate too much straying. While Hillman calls it the acorn, other Jungians might call it the self, with a capital S. Religious language might call it God or the Holy Spirit. But we're not debating philosophical vocabulary or theology here. I'm pointing out that different cultures keep returning to this same shared experience. All these words are just our effort to name it. Hillman puts it like this. These words and names do not tell us what it is, but they do confirm that it is. They also point to its mysteriousness. We cannot know what exactly we are referring to because its nature remains shadowy, revealing itself mainly in hints, intuitions, whispers, and the sudden urges and oddities that disturb your life and that we continue to call symptoms. Whatever name you give it, the key idea for today's discussion is this. Not every victory we achieve on the road of growth is aligned with the shape of our own acorn. Some successes arrive like offers, clean, official, and even deserved, and yet they still pull us off course. In Eleusis, Theseus is about to win something that looks like a perfect ending, a crown. But is that crown, deserved though it may be, aligned with the shape of his acorn, that inner impulse that sent him out from Theseus in the first place? And what does that mean for you and I? I love time-lapse videos of plants growing. They always show the same strange fact. Before a seed reaches for the light, it commits to the dark. It has to go down before it can grow up. And that's the shape of Theseus' road. If we zoom out, his journey runs from the little city of Theseus to Athena, the center of power, recognition, and public life in ancient Greece. This follows the same pattern we see in those time-lapse videos. First comes the descent, the underroad of growth, where what's hidden has to be met. Periphetes, Sinis, and the Chromionian Sow are all illustrations of what it means to honestly face the limiting beliefs, fears, and raw appetite within ourselves. And then to hold that tension, the tension of seeing ourselves honestly rather than in an overly flattering or overly condemning light. This is how we temper and redirect those energies, allowing them to become tools that benefit rather than harm us or our communities. In other stories, this first descending arc of the journey is depicted as the hero's descent into a cave where they face a dragon or some mortal danger and win a treasure. But a treasure, once won in the darkness of a cave, to be of any worth, must be brought out into the light. And a seed cannot stay underground forever. After meeting the sow, Theseus' road turns upward. And this is the beginning of the ascent arc of growing upwards, up into the light. This is where the depth and grounding gained in the first arc become visible. And the opposition Theseus and we face on this arc changes too. Now, the thresholds we must cross wear the faces of authority figures, and the struggle becomes social, public even, and involves action rather than simply recognition. In Theseus' story, Skiron marks that turn. His test is a social ritual, a demand for deference, the old authority asking you to kneel. But we encounter him outside the city, on the cliffs of Megara. He may have the reputation of being a ruler, but he's still a force that we encounter in the relative privacy of our own intimate meeting with the unconscious. He is the test of whether we are really able to hold the tension between the unconscious energy of the insights we have gained, or whether we'll over-identify with them and become inflated. In the last episode, we spoke about that process in detail, and after publishing it, I found a meme on the internet that humorously depicts what inflation might look like and how it leads to dissolution, that is, more unconsciousness, rather than an expansion in conscious awareness and thus growth. The meme shows a monk in meditation. He's hovering in midair, wearing a saffron robe, with the caption, "I finally killed my ego. Now I am better than everyone else." It's funny because it nails the trap. The moment you identify with being beyond the ego, you've just built it a new throne, one you're completely unaware of. If you want to see the image yourself, I've put it in the expanded transcript for this episode, which is available on Substack. You can find the link in the show notes. The next challenge Theseus faces doesn't appear in the wilderness at all. It isn't a beast or a villain waiting to leap out of a ditch and ambush our hero. He's a king, sitting enthroned at the center of Eleusis. This part of the myth tests Theseus and us twice. The first test is obvious. The second is harder to spot, but it can end our journey just as surely. And this is where understanding Hillman's Acorn image really matters. So with all that out of the way, we're off to catch up with Theseus in the ancient city of Elewsina, Eleusis, where Demeter is revered. In English, we know her as Demeter, goddess of the ripened grain. It's a place of thresholds, a place of rites, a place where you bring an offering to Demeter Megalathea, Demeter, the great goddess, and receive her blessing. And that offering is not a bull or a crown. It's a piglet, a small, squealing, bristling scrap of appetite, the Chromionian sow in miniature, an image that holds incredible symbolic weight. It's as if, in this place, the innocent offspring of that wild, misaligned energy of the sow is finally reunited with the image of the Great Mother archetype. Here in Eleusis, the bestial nature of instinct is redeemed. Theseus' confrontation with Kerkyon is about to show us how that might happen in our own lives too. So without further ado, let's step into the story. Theseus followed the road from Megara away from the salt spray and the vertical drop of the cliffs until he reached the fertile, heavy silence of the Thriasian plain. In the late afternoon light, the world felt different. The grey road of the isthmus had been a place of blurred edges and shifting meaning. But as he descended the jagged line of the mountain path, he saw grey walls ahead, ancient, immovable, and certain. This, he knew, was the earthly home of the great goddess Demeter. This was Elewsina. Inside these walls, the air didn't move with the freedom of the coast. It was thick with the smells of cooking fires and human life, the stagnant weight of a city that had forgotten how to exhale. He threaded through the narrow streets, stalls, awnings, smoke-blackened doorways. A vendor's shout died mid-syllable. Another voice lowered. Eyes met his, held for a heartbeat, then turned away. He'd never walked these lanes, but he knew the story of this place, where the great goddess came grieving, searching for her daughter taken by the underworld. And now, the city rehearsed that old motion. A woman yanked her child close and hurried off down an alleyway. A young man turned away, suddenly more interested in a nearby stone wall than in whatever he had been doing. With each step, a fissure of silence opened in front of him. As he passed, it sealed again behind him. Bodies and sounds closing over the gap, settling back into their old rhythm as though nothing had happened. He'd never walked these lanes, but Theseus did not need directions. the city itself provided them, and he followed. The lanes widened and delivered him into a town square washed in late afternoon sunlight. At its center was a ring of hard earth, packed smooth by the stamp of thousands of feet. The place didn't look like a market anymore. It looked like a court. A man waited on the far side of the circle. He sat so still, so heavy in himself, that for a moment Theseus mistook him for one of the temple statues. Until he shifted. Of course, it had to be a man. Statues didn't move. He seemed too large for the city scene. Shoulders like quarried stone, a neck like a tree stump, his forearms thick as old roots, hands as wide and rough as river rock. This, Theseus knew, was Cercyon, the famous king of Elefsina. Even seated, he looked less like a ruler than a landmark. Rumors hung around him like his deep purple robes. Some swore Poseidon's blood ran in his veins. Others named Hephaestus. Still others, in hushed tones, murmured Arcadia. Looking at him now, Theseus wasn't sure there was any blood there at all. Maybe those muscles were fed by the pulsing flow of gravel and fire. For a moment, Cercyon only looked at him, slowly, like a man reading an inscription he already knew by heart.
"Traveler,"
he said at last. His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. Theseus bowed his head.
"Your Majesty."
Something like recognition, cool, almost indifferent, passed across Cercyon's face.
"You know where you are."
"Yes, sire. I know what they call this city."
"And what do they call me?"
Theseus raised his eyes and held the king's gaze.
Gilgamesh.
Around the circle of packed earth, a small group of onlookers had gathered.
Good. Then we can spare ourselves the long version.
He lifted one hand, 2 fingers, barely a gesture. A boy at the edge of the square moved quickly, as if grateful to have something to do. He brought a clay cup and a small jug. Cercyon nodded towards it.
"Water."
Theseus looked at the cup in the boy's trembling hand, then back at the king.
"You offer it?"
He asked.
"I do.
Cercyon's eyes stayed on him.
In Elefsina, we honor custom."
Theseus stepped forward, took the cup, and drank. Cercyon watched him swallow.
"And now, will you return my kindness by telling me your name, traveler?"
"Sire, I am Theseus."
A murmur rippled around the circle, fast, suppressed. Cercyon's smile widened a fraction.
"Theseus of Trizina, grandson of King Pythias."
Theseus said nothing.
"You've been busy on the road. It seems the stories of your exploits have traveled faster than you. I didn't expect a man like you to come all the way to my humble city."
The crowd shifted. Someone whispered a prayer not meant for ears. Theseus kept his voice level.
"If there are stories, they aren't for me to tell, sire."
Cercyon made a sound that might have been a laugh.
"Ha! A modest hero. That's new. Welcome to Elefsina, Theseus of Trizina. Here a traveler receives a gift,
He nodded to the cleared circle.
a contest."
Theseus glanced at the hard, packed earth. Cercyon's tone stayed almost courteous.
"No weapons. Only wrestling."
Somewhere in the city, a dog barked.
"And if I refuse?"
Theseus asked. Cercyon's eyes didn't change, but the air did.
To refuse is to insult the gods who guard custom.
"And you, your Majesty?"
Cercyon's gaze swept the crowd, then returned.
It would be an insult to the city.
His fist dropped onto his knee.
To custom.
Theseus nodded once.
And if I accept your offer?
Cercyon leaned forward. The purple folds shifted over his knees like something living.
If you win, everything that is mine becomes yours. My house, my lands, my crown.
A whisper moved through the ring. The kingdom.
And if I lose?
There was no warmth in Cercyon's smile, only teeth.
Then you'll pay the toll, like the rest. Your spirit can go where it likes, but your body will remain here, feeding the soil and the birds of my kingdom.
Theseus looked at the circle, looked at the king's hands, wide as stones, resting on his thighs, looked at the faces lining the arena that would not meet his eyes. He handed the cup back to the boy and wiped his mouth.
So, this is your hospitality,
he said. Cercyon's head tilted, almost amused.
You drank, didn't you?
Theseus breathed out once, as if making space inside himself. He laid his belongings, the club, his sword, the sandals and his tunic at the edge of the arena. And then he stepped into the ring.
Then, I accept your gift, O king,
he said. Cercyon rose. No sword, no guards. He let his heavy cloak fall into the dust and stepped into the circle. The crowd around them went quiet, the way animals go quiet when something larger enters the clearing.
Good,
Cercyon said, rolling his shoulders as if waking a familiar habit.
Now, show me what kind of man you are.
Theseus widened his stance and lifted his hands, open, steady.
Show me,
he said,
what kind of king you are.
The two men circled one another, sizing up every movement. Cercyon was a wall of muscle, and worse, experienced. He moved with the confidence of a man who had never been defeated. He expected Theseus to strain against him, to push back, to play the game by the old brutal rules that pitted strength against strength. But when their bodies finally met, Theseus didn't. He was no longer the boy who'd swung at Herakles' lion's skin with an axe. The road had trained him, taught him the purpose of strength and when it's a mistake to rely on it. He settled his weight and listened. He could feel the bronze club in his stance now, no longer a weapon, but a way of standing. He didn't rush forward. He didn't push back. Theseus feigned a lunge, then retreated a few paces, giving way, creating the space that would soon be filled with Cercyon's bulk. He could feel his blood rushing like the wind through the tall pines of the isthmus, and his breath came with the steady patience of the creature waiting below the insatiable swell of the bad bay. He waited for Cercyon to decide, like tyrants always do, that the smaller man would break. He would use the bigger man's certainty, as Theseus had used the pines, to bind his opponent to the choice he had made, and then shred his chance of victory with its opposite. The king lunged. Theseus allowed him to believe it. He yielded the space, just a breath, just a half step, like a man stepping back from the edge of a cliff. Cercyon's power surged forward, unstoppable and, for an instant, uncontrollable, even for himself. That was the opening. Theseus twisted, turned, and pivoted into it, hard and decisive, the savage appetite of that bristled Chromionian beast stampeding through his veins. Cercyon tried to recover by doing what he had always done, by closing in, by crushing. And as that weight came down on him, Theseus didn't resist it head-on. He moved with it, shifting his center of gravity just a fraction. And then, in a motion that looked more like a dance than a fight, he reached in deep, hooked the king beneath his center, and lifted. For the first time in his long, brutal reign, Cercyon's feet left the earth. The king flailed as he came ungrounded. He was no longer the Arcadian oak. He was just a man suspended in the empty air. Theseus held him there for a heartbeat, an embrace that was both a death sentence and a revelation. And then he drove him down, hard into the very dust the king used to rule. An ugly snapping sound echoed around the arena. Cercyon, the son of Poseidon, Hephaestus, or of some Arcadian line, was gone. The circle was silent. The elders of Elevsina began to stir. Their faces, like wet candles, sputtered between expressions of terror and a sudden, desperate relief. But before they could speak, a young man broke through the crowd. He was ragged, his eyes wide and bright with a hope that looked like a wound. This was Hippothon, the son of the murdered Princess Alope, daughter of Cercyon. Theseus looked at the boy and felt a sudden, cold jolt of recognition. He saw in the set of his shoulders and the particular light in his eyes the same salt-etched heritage his mother, Ethra, had spoken of when he was a child in Thesina.
Maybe you're the son of a god, Theseus. Maybe you are the son of Poseidon.
In the youth, he saw a mirror of his own hidden history. Here was another son of Poseidon, the Earth Shaker, a half-brother in spirit, standing in the wreckage of a family line that had turned inward and rotted. One of the elders who had gathered up Cercyon's royal robes stepped forward. In his hand, he held the crown of Elevsina.
The law is met by the king's own oath. The throne belongs now to you, Theseus of Thesina.
Theseus looked at the crown. He looked at the faces of the gathered crowd. Maybe it was the light of the early evening, or maybe it was an inward light, the light of hope that made their faces glow. Life could be comfortable here. It would be so easy to stop, to rule, to seat himself in the high place at the center of this old city. At the edge of the ring, the bronze club and the bronze sword lay where he had placed them. In the light of the evening, they looked gold. He remembered the rock in Thesina, the sword and the sandals. Those tokens weren't meant for an Eleusinian throne. They were meant for Athena. To stay here would be to build a kingdom around a detour. Theseus reached out, not for the crown, but for Hippothon's hand. He pulled the young man forward in front of the elder.
Honorable elder, my path leads elsewhere,
He said.
This is your king, King Hippothon, son of Cercyon's murdered daughter Alope, and of my father, Poseidon, the Earth Shaker.
All around the circle, the crowd broke into cheers, and the celebrations continued long into the night. The next morning, Theseus gathered his belongings, shouldered his burden, and set out again. He followed the path walked by the initiates of the mysteries out of Elevsina towards Athena. Athena was closer now. He could almost smell the smoke of his father's hearth. Amplification. Cercyon, the wrestling king. Until now, the forces on Theseus' road, Periphetes, Sinis, the Chromionian Sow, rise out of the spaces between towns and cities. Skiron marks a turning point. He's still situated outside a city, but he's elevated by the rising road. And as we saw last time, his implied nobility is part of the danger he represents. Cities stand for conscious order. Beyond them is psychic life too vast to be fully brought inside. The task isn't to conquer what can't be tamed, but to learn its terms so that we can live with it without doing or sustaining harm. So when the story begins presenting forces of opposition that come packaged with social order or hierarchical overtones, cultural cues that the ancient Greek audience would certainly have picked up on, but which get flattened by our modern views of heroes and villains, we can read it as a change in the nature of the work being done. As noted earlier, in this myth, the shift occurs with Skiron. In the previous installment, he appears outside the city, along the path through the wilderness. But he's not just a bandit. We learned how, despite the fact that we meet him in the liminal space of the wild, to the storytellers of Megara at least, Skiron bore a reputation of nobility, of authority, and civic status. The image of Cercyon continues in this direction. He sits enthroned at the center of Elefsina, charged, at least in the eyes of the city, with preserving order and custom. Plutarch slips in a detail that's easy to miss. He doesn't just describe him as Cercyon the king, he says Cercyon the Arcadian. Arcadia, or Arcadia, is Pan country, the landscape where shepherds, nymphs, and even the mountains move to the Saturnian rhythms of the Golden Age. Pan is that landscape given a body, hooves and horns, shaggy legs, appetite, and music, more at home in groves than temples. In one famous tale, the nymph Syrinx flees him and escapes by becoming a bunch of reeds. Pan cuts the reeds, binds them together, and the Pan pipes enter the world. Every encounter with this god is marked by a feral throb beneath the skin of civility. That's the spirit Plutarch conjures into the throne room when he calls Cercyon the Arcadian. Robert Louis Stevenson catches the feeling perfectly. You can, he says, hear the goat-footed piper making the music which is itself the charm and terror of things. So, while Skiron shows us twisted nobility exercising authority beyond the city walls, Cercyon inverts it. He is repression embodied, cloven-hoofed Arcadia, pressed down and disguised beneath royal robes. And if there's one thing that we know about repression, it's this. What we pave over doesn't just disappear. It gathers pressure beneath the surface until it breaks containment. And when that happens, what emerges is rarely pretty. We see that clearly with Cercyon. The stories clustered around him are brutal. Hyginus and Pausanias both tell us that he puts his daughter Alope to death after she bears a child to Poseidon. After Theseus kills Cercyon, it's this child, Hippothon, who steps forward to claim the kingdom. If Cercyon were a character in a modern story, we'd expect some account of how the people of his city respond to this brutality. But myth works differently. The king, the city, and its citizens all form one psychic system. There's no public outcry because the cruelty is authorized by his station. It's woven into the fabric of the place. And the same thing happens in each of us. When an unhealthy habit or maladaptive pattern has a throne, we rarely meet it with protest. We rationalize it. We make excuses and accept it as part of who we are, no matter what it costs us over time. By all accounts, Cercyon is very strong, but the sources can't quite agree on where that strength comes from. Some make him the son of Poseidon, others connect him to Hephaestus, and still others offer different genealogies, each trying in its own way to account for his terrible force. Regardless, Cercyon is not presented as a bandit on the road. He is a legitimate ruler whose strength represents the weight of tradition, custom, and this is how things are done. In our modern lives, kings don't only live in palaces. They can rule as reputation or habit, a center of conscious authority that once held things together, but which can grow stale and eventually requires renewal. The image of the king in need of renewal. Cercyon is not the first king we've discussed, and he won't be the last. Back in episode 2, The Bull and the Burnout, we spent time with King Minos of Crete, the ruler who tried to stabilize his world by clinging to a gift from Poseidon, and ends up building a labyrinth to hide the results of his insecurity. Cercyon belongs to the same family of images. In amplifying these images, it's important to remember that one image can carry several truths at once. The king isn't only a political leader. He's the organizing center, the authority a whole system arranges itself around. In a tribe, that might be a chief. In a city, it's a ruler or a mayor, the laws, the customs. In the psyche, it's the way we hold ourselves together, our identity, our sense of this is who I am, or this is how life works, or perhaps this is what I do in these situations. In her 1971 book, An Introduction to the Interpretation of Fairy Tales, Marie-Louise von Franz explains how in many traditional societies, the king matters less because he's morally superior than because he contains the vitality of the group. If the king withers, the kingdom withers. If he becomes impotent, the land becomes barren. And when that potency fades, renewal is demanded, sometimes symbolically, sometimes literally, and very often violently. She goes on to describe what happens when such an ordering center wears out. She points out, and I think it bears repeating here, that the king is a symbol of the self. It's not the actual archetypal self, but a symbolic image set up as an organizing principle in the conscious psyche. Regarding the aging and wearing out of this symbol, she writes, "If you study the comparative history of religions, you'll note the tendency for any religious ritual or dogma that has become conscious to wear out after a time, to lose its original emotional impact and become a dead formula. Although it also acquires the positive qualities of consciousness, such as continuity, it loses the irrational contact with the flow of life and tends to become mechanical. This is true not only of religious doctrines and political systems, but for everything else as well, because when something has long been conscious, the wine goes out of the bottle. It becomes a dead world. Therefore, if our conscious life is to avoid petrifaction, there is a necessity for the constant renewal by the contact with the flow of psychic events in the unconscious, and the king, being the dominant and most central symbol in the contents of the collective unconscious, is naturally subject to this need to an even greater extent. Although that's a bit of a mouthful, it's a beautiful way to describe what people mean when they say, "I don't feel like myself anymore. I feel stuck. I don't know why I keep doing this." When that happens, it's not the deepest center, the actual self, or daimon, or the acorn, to use Hillman's language, that is suffering depletion. It's the rule set, the image, or the symbol of who we think we are that has run out of power. That old king can no longer hold the life force in a healthy way. And then, renewal isn't optional. Something must shift, or the inner kingdom petrifies. And notice where the renewal comes from. In von Franz's line, she says, "by contact with the flow of psychic events in the unconscious." In myth, that contact often arrives from outside the walls of the city. Theseus approaches Eleusis as an outsider, carrying precisely that disruptive power of renewal within him. Up to now, the work we've been doing in this series has mostly been inward, a matter of recognition, naming, reframing, defusing shame, seeing what's going on underneath. Insight is important in this kind of work. But insight alone doesn't dethrone a king. A king can be replaced when a new center proves that it can actually hold the kingdom together. Cercyon invites travelers to wrestle. The offer is enticing. His kingdom if they win. And he kills them when they lose. No appeals, no second chances. I know that offer, and I'm sure you do too. Some of our habits rule us like that. As soon as we make any attempt to change, they clamp down. We may set out feeling heroically charged to grow, and then suddenly we're tired, distracted, ashamed, or craving relief. Anything that gets us to drop our guard. And then you blink, and you're back where you started. This may be a story about wrestling, but it isn't really a story about muscles or strength. It's a story about what you do when the old pattern gets its hands on you. And I've got some good news for you. There are more ways to win in this wrestling match than simply being strong. Wrestling. Growing up, I avoided sports, partly because music is a very important part of my life and a finger injury could shut down flute or piano practice for weeks, partly because of social anxiety, and partly because after several rounds of corrective eye surgery when I was young, I never developed good depth perception. When I played that child-friendly version of tennis with the big spongy orange ball, my teacher always said, "Keep your eye on the ball." I tried, and I missed. The only chance I had was watching the shadow of the ball on the ground. But even then, my attempts at connecting racket to ball did little more than circulate the air. I've read that chaos theory suggests a butterfly flapping its wings in the Amazon may set off storms in Europe. On behalf of Little Dim, I offer my sincere apologies to anyone affected by my early attempts at racket or bat-based ball sports. Of course, it's equally possible that my wild swings prevented a few tornadoes, and for that, you're welcome. I'll wear that cap with pride. All of this is to say, I don't know much about wrestling as a sport, but I do know its metaphor. If you've ever tried to shake a bad habit, change the way you respond under pressure, or commit to something that matters, practice, study, or creation, while 1,000 other things compete for your attention, then you know it too. Wrestling is ancient. It shows up in early literature and in the earliest visual records of organized combat. Tim Delaney and Tim Madigan point to the cave paintings at Lascaux in France, dated roughly 15,000 to 17,000 years ago, and suggest wrestling may be the oldest sport. They also add an important caution, though. These ancient depictions of wrestling or any sport-like activity isn't the same thing as the modern sports with which we are acquainted. In many cultures, human and animal, wrestling-like behavior is a way of establishing order, settling questions of dominance and submission. And it's that older, more primal sense of wrestling that matters here when we're talking about Theseus' road. Wrestling the Wild, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Wrestling is a central image of pivotal importance in the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest surviving works of literature we have. The story comes down through a long chain of Mesopotamian tablets and versions, reaching back into the early 2nd millennium BCE and beyond. It follows Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, 2/3 divine, 1/3 mortal, and, at the start of the tale at least, an absolute menace. He is quite possibly the first literary portrait of a tyrant whose legitimacy is founded on building a wall. Gilgamesh mistreats the people of his city, men and women alike, until the outcry reaches the gods. And so Aruru, goddess who creates life, fashions a counterforce, Enkidu, a wild man formed of clay living on the steppes, undoing traps and disrupting the machinery of civilization at its edge. One day, a hunter sees Enkidu and panics, and the story kicks into a mythic civilizing sequence involving a lot of sex, food, clothing, and a haircut, until Enkidu arrives in Uruk to challenge the king. He meets Gilgamesh at the gates of a wedding feast, and they grapple. There are no weapons involved here, so we can read it as wrestling, and the match doesn't end in a clean victory. Despite this, Gilgamesh kneels and claims victory anyway, even though they seem evenly matched. But then, something startling happens. The two opponents become inseparable. From here, they go on and have many adventures together, hunting and defeating demons. But that's another story for another time. For now, notice the structure. Two incomplete forces meet: Gilgamesh, the corrupted king in need of renewal, and Enkidu, the counterforce raised from beyond the city's order. Through the grappling, both Gilgamesh and Enkidu are changed. They find wholeness and completion. And that's why this story matters for Theseus. Whether it's Cercyon meeting Theseus or Gilgamesh meeting Enkidu, the pattern is the same. Something from beyond the walls arrives to challenge the ruling center, and that change occurs when the two forces come into close contact with one another. Myth chooses the image of wrestling for this, not a duel from a distance, but a contest close enough to feel breath and body heat, a contest of leverage, balance, and will. In Theseus' story, it ends in death and succession. Cercyon falls and the crown passes through Theseus to Hippothon. In Gilgamesh, it ends in a different kind of renewal. The desire for dominance turns into a deep and loving bond. The king isn't changed by advice or even by the protests of his people. He's changed by contact with his opposite. That's the point I want to carry back from Uruk to Elefsina. Because the king is to the city what our habitual patterns are to us. The organizing center that sets the rules, decides what gets expressed when, and keeps the system running, whether it's healthy or not. Myth shows renewal as one ruler falling and another taking its place. Lived experience is much messier. The old pattern doesn't vanish on cue. Change arrives when we meet its force, stay present, and learn to redirect the energy, almost like wrestling, into a new channel. Wrestling is a really good image for that. It asks for the same skill set: recognition, contact, balance, and responsiveness, the ability to yield without collapsing, and the ability to resist without rigidity. How to win when wrestling. From the story of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, we can see that victory in this grappling struggle for renewal can take many forms. Gilgamesh kneels and claims victory even without a clean win. And yet, the king who rises after that isn't the same king who entered the fight. Before we return to Elefsina, there are two more wrestling stories worth bringing into this circle. Each turns the lens and shows a different facet of what winning can mean in the story and in our own lives. Jacob and the Angel. This story is borrowed from the tradition of the Hebrew Bible, the story of Jacob wrestling an angel. I'll retell it, but you'll be able to find it in Genesis chapter 32, between verses 22 and 31. Jacob is on the move with his family. After many years, he's finally headed back to make things right with his brother Esau. He reaches the edge of a river and sets up camp. Rivers are borders, thresholds that can be difficult to cross, but they're also channels. They both divide and irrigate the land. They flow and carry the current forward. We use the language of water, rain, and rivers to talk about our experiences in life. We talk about going through a dry spell, or that inspiration has run dry. We describe certain seasons of life as being times in which things finally start flowing again. This is river talk. It's also a language that helps us identify a threshold that we need to cross, or perhaps have already crossed. In the story, Jacob sends everyone across the river first: wives, servants, and children. I imagine them picking their way across the shallow river as the sun sets and the first stars in the purple sky reflect on the fast-flowing water. Jacob, however, stays behind at the camp. He's left alone on the near bank of the river. And then, the text says, a man, printed with a capital M, comes to him in the dark and wrestles with him. This goes on all night, and as dawn approaches, the man finds he cannot force Jacob into submission, so he touches Jacob's hip and dislocates it. Even when he is injured, Jacob refuses to release the man, and there, in the spreading of the pre-dawn light, Jacob says something almost shocking in its stubborn insistence. "I won't let you go until you bless me." The man asks Jacob his name, and then renames him. Israel, for you have struggled with God and with men, and have prevailed. When Jacob asks the man his name, the man replies, "Why do you ask me my name?" and blesses him. That's the last we see of that man. Having received a new name himself, Jacob renames the place on the bank of the river, Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved." And then the story ends with a beautiful line. Just as he crossed over Peniel, the sun rose on him, and he limped on his hip. Genesis chapter 32, verse 31. In this story, Jacob is the one in need of renewal. He needs to mend the rift between himself and his brother caused by his deception years earlier. And here, through this wrestling match that takes place on the verge of a threshold, he is changed. But again, we see a different definition of victory in this story. He eventually crosses that threshold with a limp. It's a victory won not by besting his opponent, but by refusing to be subdued by him. And as a result, he also receives a new name. Renaming is one of those recurring renewal images in myth. The old name can't contain the new life, so the story gives a new one. I wrote about that more in another Substack essay. If you're interested, you'll find a link in the show notes. Now, if we stay with that image, without getting lost in doctrinal debates, two things stand out. First, the opponent isn't framed as a villain. The force Jacob wrestles is aligned with the ordering power of the sacred. Call it God, call it the self, call it the daimon, call it the acorn. Jacob doesn't defeat the power in the usual sense, he endures contact with it. He holds on through the night and refuses to be overpowered. Second, prevailing doesn't mean walking away unscarred. Prevailing means the struggle doesn't end before the blessing is won, before the light of dawn returns order to the darkness of night, and a new name is given. So, if we ask what winning can mean, Jacob answers, sometimes victory is persistence. Sometimes victory is crossing the threshold even if you cross it limping. Sometimes the new identity is simply this: I am the one who wrestled and I did not give up. I did not give way. I did not give in. And now, hold that image, because the next wrestling story turns the lens another way. Herakles and Antaeus. For this story, we're going to take a look at Theseus' role model, Herakles. Everyone knows that Herakles is strong, but in this story, as with Theseus' own, strength is secondary. On his way through Libya for the 11th labor, Herakles meets Antaeus. The sources describe him as the ruler of Libya, a king like Cercyon. He doesn't ambush, he waits, planted in his own territory, demanding a contest from anyone who passes. And, like Cercyon, he wrestles to kill. Pindar says he used the skulls of his victims to roof the temple of his father, Poseidon. Antaeus' mother is Gea, the earth. Because of that, each time he touches the ground, he grows stronger. He draws power from the earth itself. Oblivious to this, Herakles grapples, he throws, he drives Antaeus into the dust. And each time, Antaeus springs up stronger, recharged, while Herakles begins to tire. So the hero changes the move. He lifts him, disconnecting him from the ground, cutting him off from his source. Suspended, Antaeus weakens. Only then can Herakles finally finish the struggle. He crushes him in a giant bear hug. That's the whole image in one motion. Herakles wins by ungrounding his opponent, drawing him in close, and hugging him. I think there's medicine in that. Returning to Elefsina. In his descriptions of Greece, Pausanias pauses while describing the surroundings of Eleusis to talk about the fight, because this fight really mattered. He says Theseus defeats Cercyon not by physical size or sheer force, but by skill, a revolutionary act in wrestling. Theseus refuses to wrestle by Cercyon's rules. He refuses to let tradition set the limits of what's possible, and he changes the terms of the contest. What are the traditions that you've held to in your own wrestling matches in the past? What has dictated how you wrestled with old behavior patterns that no longer serve you? Apollodorus preserves a variation of the story. He tells us that Theseus wins in a Heraclean fashion by lifting Cercyon high and driving him down. Put those two versions together, and something useful emerges. The victory isn't in brute strength. It's in the refusal to act according to the old terms, and then the skill or tenacity to embody that refusal. This brings us back to our own wrestling matches. On the path of our own growth, it's rarely people that we have to wrestle, at least not in the straightforward sense. Yes, sometimes there's external conflict, but what really hooks us, drains us, and repeats is often an inner pattern, old and established enough to feel like a natural reflex. Trying to change something like that can feel like wrestling Antaeus. Each time you put it down, swear it off, or pin it to the ground, it rises up again, stronger. In a real fight, you don't keep driving into your opponent's strongest point. You look for the angle that yields, the gap in their defense, the place where the pattern can't keep doing what it's always done. That's also where our opponents target us. What is that gap for you? Is it a wish to escape stress? The hunger for comfort? A craving for a quick reward? Or is it that persuasive voice that says, just one more time, change can wait? That voice is dangerous because it doesn't argue against your goal. It doesn't try and prove you incapable. It simply makes the goal feel optional for right now. It promises you'll return to the road after one last detour. It lies. Those are the moments in which we find ourselves wrestling on the dark bank of a river like Jacob. Those are the moments in which winning means holding to the opponent, not giving in to its attempts to overthrow us, drawing it in close until the light of dawn brings with it clarity. Some patterns grow stronger each time they touch down. Each time we give in or let go, they drop back into automaticity, into the place where they just happen and we can't quite say why. So sometimes the task isn't to crush the pattern or to put as much distance between it and us as possible. Sometimes it's to draw it in close, lift it up into consciousness and hold it there, steady, without flinching and without collapsing into shame, until the light of dawn brings clarity. And when it does, we may walk away limping, but we will walk away changed, renamed, redefined, and no longer ruled by the power that once held us. This is one reason why good therapy can be so effective. And I'll say this carefully. It's not because the therapist fixes you, but because a skilled therapist can help you keep contact long enough for clarity to arrive. I've come to recognize this in my own experience in the client's chair. My wonderful counselor called it the therapy fairy. The therapy fairy isn't magic. It's what happens when something that used to rule from below is held up to the light long enough for us to see its shape. And once that shape is seen, a new move becomes possible. This is the move we've been circling since Periphetes and the Bronze Club, since Sinis and the balancing of opposites. It's not repression, pushing the unwanted thing down and away, but the closer work of staying in contact and redirecting the energy rather than denying it. Gilgamesh gives the same structure in another key. The tyrant king meets an equal raised from the wild. They grapple, and the shift arrives when the quest for dominance resolves into wholeness and renewal. That's what Theseus accomplishes in Elefsina. But after that victory comes the second test. Because removing the tyrant clears the seat, but it doesn't tell you what to do with it. So ask yourself, if the throne were offered to you, would you take it? Would you settle in that seat, rule in your own Elefsina, and forget the sandals and the sword, the signs you once trusted as your destiny? Or would you heed the Acorn's pull, the same tide that carried you out onto the open road in the first place? Are you strong enough to refuse a throne when your road isn't yet finished? The passing of the crown and Acorn theory. Some victories expand the road. Others try to end it early. There's a particular temptation that can follow progress. The temptation to stop where you are and build a kingdom around the ground you've just claimed. We've already brushed up against that on Skiron's cliff, where the hero is tested not by brute force, but by the lure of the false authority that demands submission. Elefsina offers Theseus a version of the same test, but this time wearing the robes of legitimacy. When he defeats Cercyon, he wins by Cercyon's own terms the right to rule. He stands in the center of a city that could recognize him as king, and it would all look clean, official, even deserved. But notice what would happen if he stayed. Theseus overthrows Cercyon by rejecting the rules of the corrupted ruler, by refusing to let Cercyon's authority over how things are done dictate how he responds in the wrestling match. If, after that, he accepts the throne, he would, after his victory, be accepting and playing by Cercyon's rules once again. His victory would dissolve, and with it, his purpose and the sword and the sandals that mark it would be erased. His journey would end here, in what might look like a victory, but ultimately be a betrayal of the calling of his own soul. In Theseus' story, the hero image isn't only modeling courage, it's modeling discernment, how to tell the difference between a true step forward and a beautiful-looking detour. Because life offers us crowns all the time. Early praise, a promotion, an opportunity, or a role that fits well enough in the moment that it feels like fate. And sometimes those offers are good. Sometimes they're earned. Sometimes they arrive with a sense of relief. Finally, a place to stop. But relief, you see, isn't the same as alignment. If on our road we are chasing goals defined by others, by what we feel society or our friends and family expect of us, then there's a very good chance that we eventually end up taking up that crown and waking up years later wondering why everything feels so meaningless. So many of us settle without ever meaning to. We drift into careers or relationships, identities, reputations that reward us quickly or satisfy someone else's idea of who we should become. We accept the crown because it's there, because it's legible, because it looks like success from the outside. And then, one day we wake up with the quiet, unnerving feeling that von France gestures at when she says, "The wine has gone out of the bottle." Nothing is wrong exactly, and yet something essential has thinned out. The life force has gone flat. Our acorn hasn't died. It's been denied and asked to grow into a shape that isn't its own. That's the payoff that this story has for us here. Theseus doesn't confuse "I can" with "I must." He doesn't turn a local victory into his final identity. After Cercyon falls, another figure steps forward, Hippothon, Alopi's son, the one who, in the Eleusinian strand of the tradition, holds the rightful claim to the place Theseus has just freed. Theseus' actions are important here precisely because they are so unglamorous. He yields the crown. This isn't performance of virtue. It's Theseus aligning himself with the deeper trajectory of his own soul, showing that he knows where he stands in relation to his calling. He doesn't confuse, I can take this crown, with, I must take this crown. He lets kingship go where it belongs, and then he returns to the road, still a traveler, still unfinished, still answerable to the larger pattern that called him out of Theseus in the first place. May we all be that wise. Reflection. Before I leave you with some reflection prompts, let's take a look at the pattern we've uncovered in today's stories. We've seen it again and again at the gates of Uruk, on the riverbank with Jacob, and in the dust of Libya, and in the wrestling ground of Elefsina. Each story is supported by the same bones. First, a threshold is reached. Second, an old ruling pattern is confronted. Third, the victory comes not through brute force, but through drawing closer, through lifting, and through balance. And finally, the renewal of a burned-out, corrupted, or depleted pattern occurs through the contact with a psychic energy arriving from outside of normal consciousness. The archetypal images in these myths are precisely that type of energy. That's why stories have been used as a kind of medicine for as long as our species has been able to tell them. But here's where we need to slow down, because in real life, not every opponent yields. Not every pattern breaks open when we ask it to. There are things about ourselves and about the world that we may not be able to change. And there are things we can. Knowing the difference, well, that's another very real kind of wrestling match. I'm not here to answer that question of what you can change about yourself and what you cannot. During classes and workshops, I've been asked this type of question over and over, and each time the only answer I can give is, I can't tell you what you can change about yourself. No one can. That's soul work. That's Acorn work. Answering those questions for yourself takes courage, because they ask each of us to be honest with ourselves about what's ours to carry and what isn't. But even when change feels out of reach, there's something else that we can do. We can learn to redirect energy. The story of Jacob shows us this. Not every struggle ends with a victory or conquest. Sometimes we limp away from the threshold wounded, but changed nonetheless. And Gilgamesh reminds us that even when the wild one cannot be conquered, he can be embraced. And that embrace begins the real transformation, even if it isn't the transformation we were initially expecting. So maybe the question isn't always, can I win this fight? Can I change this or that about myself? Perhaps the deeper question is, can I stay close to what I would rather avoid long enough to understand what it needs and why it's appearing in my life? Victory isn't always dominance. Sometimes victory is contact. Sometimes it's embrace. Here are 4 prompts you can use to explore how the stories in this episode connect to your life. Use them for journaling or simply pondering. If one of them seems to speak to you more than the others, that's fine. Focus on it. And if you'd like to share any thoughts or insights that pop up for you, I'd love to hear from you. You can find a text version of these prompts in the expanded transcript for this episode available over on my Substack. You can get there via the transcripts menu item in the top right corner of your screen on my website at www.theinwardsea.com. That's www.theinwardsea.com. Reflection Prompt 1. The nature of the struggle. What am I wrestling with right now? And am I trying to overpower it, avoid it, or stay in contact with it? This is one of those questions that doesn't ask for a quick answer. It asks for a pause. Take a moment to name what you're struggling with right now. Not what you think you should be struggling with, but what's actually pulling on you, draining you, and showing up again and again. And then ask yourself, how am I meeting this thing? Am I trying to crush it, ignore it, or am I staying in conscious contact with it, even when it's hard? This is Jacob's wisdom. He doesn't win by striking down his opponent. He wins by not letting go. He stays through the night. Sometimes that's what real strength looks like. Not pushing harder, but staying present without yielding to the parts of yourself that you'd rather avoid. Reflection prompt 2. The script of identity. What pain or pattern have I mistaken for just the way I am? We all carry stories about ourselves, some given to us and some we wrote to survive. Over time, these stories solidify into identities. I'm just like this. That's just how I am. But what if that pain or that reflex isn't the truth of who you are, just something that you've carried for a very long time? Before Enkidu, Gilgamesh mistook his domination for strength. It took a wild mirror to show him something different. Sometimes the traits we think are fixed are really just strategies that we've outgrown. This isn't about blame, it's about compassion. If you look closely, is there something in you that has been waiting to be seen differently? Reflection prompt 3. The paradox of the embrace. What would it look like to lift my problematic pattern into an embrace? Not to satisfy its demands, but to hear its real hunger. In the heat of the struggle, our instinct is to shove the rejected behavior away, to pin it down, or to flee from it. But Herakles won by drawing Antaeus into a close embrace and lifting him off the ground. Think of a pattern you've been fighting, perhaps a compulsion, a specific type of reactivity, or a cycle of avoidance. What if, instead of trying to push it down, you lifted it up into the light of awareness? This isn't about giving in to the behavior or satisfying a damaging urge. It's about ungrounding the pattern from the place where it happens automatically. When you draw it close, you can begin to ask, what is the unmet need at the heart of this pattern? What is the unrecognized hunger that this behavior is trying, however clumsily or destructively, to feed? Compassion isn't permission. It's the skill of seeing clearly. It is the realization that the wild thing you are wrestling might actually be a part of you that has been starved of a better way to survive. Can you hold it long enough to find out what it's actually looking for? Reflection prompt 4. Growing downward. Where in my life do I feel stunted? And what would it mean to grow downward there? To put down deeper roots so I can rise again with greater strength? Inspired by Hillman's Acorn theory, this question invites a shift in perspective. Instead of striving harder or reaching higher, what if what's needed is a descent, a rooting? When growth feels blocked, we often assume that something is wrong with us or that we need to just try harder. But sometimes the call is not to grow up, but to grow down, to return to the soil of our lives and to reconnect with what nourishes and grounds us. This kind of downward growth isn't glamorous, and it rarely comes with applause. But it's what allows real transformation to take place. Not just the appearance of progress, but the slow, steady unfolding of purpose from the inside out. Phew. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of this episode. It's been longer than usual, but I hope there's been something of value in here for you. This is where we will leave Theseus today. He stands at the gates of Elevsina, the dust of the wrestling match still in his skin, having just refused the crown that didn't align with his own calling. He turns his back on the easy throne because he knows his process is still incomplete, just as ours so often is. He chooses the road over the palace. He chooses the uncertainty of the next mile over the security of a dead pattern. And maybe that's where we leave ourselves too, in a way. Not in the victory of having fixed everything, but in the honest work of the threshold. We leave ourselves in that quiet, high-stakes space where real change takes root, not through solving our shadows away, but through staying in contact with them, through the clarity that comes from holding the opponent close enough to feel its heartbeat against our own. It takes a special kind of courage to stay close to the things we'd rather outrun. And if something in this episode stirred a king inside of you, if a part of your own pattern stepped forward to challenge you today, I hope you'll give yourself the grace to hold it just a little longer. Don't try to force it to change yet. Just let it speak. Let it tell you what it's been hungering for or protecting all of these years. If you'd like to go deeper into these images, you'll find the reflection prompts and the extended notes for this episode over on Substack. And if this work is meaningful to you, I'd be so grateful if you'd take a moment to subscribe, share it, or leave a review. It helps more than you know, not just in keeping us sailing on the inward sea, but in helping others find and join us in our exploration. Until next time, keep walking the road, and don't be afraid of the wrestlers you meet along the way. Hold on through the long night, and when the light of dawn finds you, may you also be able to say, I have seen the face of God, and I am renewed. My name is Dimitri, and you've been listening to The Inward Sea.